Genesis chapter 29. Now the rest of Joseph's story continues. And this will go to the end of the book. Okay. So some of the interesting things that we see here is, remember that Egypt is a pagan nation. And we see quite often throughout the Old Testament God's people in the midst of pagan peoples. Sometimes because of their own fault, other times not. But we need to remember that God works even in the midst of pagan nations to do his will. And he uses the rulers of this world even who do not know him. And it's good to keep this in mind, especially today, because by any measure, if you measure the standard for determining such things, honestly, is what do the rulers of a nation do? Right? We see throughout the history of Israel, as we get into the time of the kings, that a wicked king inevitably ended up making the people wicked. And you could almost identify the heart of a nation by the heart of their king. And yet God still worked through them, doing his will. And so now here Joseph finds himself in a pagan nation. We see a similar thing with Daniel and the three children, the Israelite boys, who, but through no fault of their own, but because of the wickedness of their nation, find themselves in the midst of the nation of Babylon. And they are always given, they always have the choice before them to continue to be faithful to the Lord and to his commandments and his testimony and his word, or to succumb to the nation in which they live, and to live like the heathens among whom they live. And it's no different with us. Genesis 39. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. Remember that slavery was the norm throughout the ancient world. You shouldn't think of slavery in the same way that we thought that it was practiced here in the United States during the time period leading up to the Civil War. There are some number of very unique things and unique wickedness about the slavery that was practiced in this nation. But slavery was common then, and Joseph was sold as a slave. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his Egyptian master. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight, and attended him. And he made him an overseer of his house, and he put him in charge of all that he had. You think that's strange because, well, how in the world would you entrust everything you have to a slave? Not uncommon in those days. Slaves in those days had many different positions in society. Many of them were teachers, for example. They were entrusted with training the students of those who owned them, or the children of those who owned them, and many other similar occupations. And so Joseph proved himself to be trustworthy, and Potiphar was wise enough to see that if he gave management of his household over to Jacob, his house would prosper because the Lord was with him. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused, and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge.
He is not greater in the house than I am. Nor has he kept back anything from me except for you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And so you see, Joseph's response to her is twofold. One, my master trusts me. He's given everything he has for me to manage, but you're his wife. Everything but you. You're his wife. I will not betray my master, nor, in the second argument, nor will I betray my God, for what you are asking me to do is great wickedness. Think of it from Joseph's perspective. There's this woman, probably a beautiful woman. He's a handsome young man. And she's certainly not going to tell Potiphar. What does he have to lose? Well, it's wicked, that's what. The Lord is with Joseph, and Joseph obeys the commandments of God, because God has been gracious to him, even in his slavery. And he will resist the temptation. We teach this verse to our children in catechism class. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? It should be on our own lips on a regular basis, because we are constantly tempted, just like Joseph was, in many ways more subtle and some bold and in our face, to commit the same sins that Joseph was here being tempted to commit with Potiphar's wife, to commit adultery. Not just adultery, of course, many similar sins. We must remember who we are. Joseph did not belong to himself. He belonged to the Lord. The Lord had kept him, and the Lord had redeemed him. The Lord had given him the promise. Remember, it was Jacob. God renewed the promise of Jacob to send the Christ. Jacob taught his children. And it's no different with us. We need to remember at times of temptation who we are. We are the people whom God has redeemed by the blood of his Son, Jesus Christ. We're in a wicked world. And in many ways, living in our sinful flesh is like a form of slavery. And yet, we have a way to overcome those temptations. And the way we overcome them is through the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the mercy that he has shown upon us and the baptism into which he has baptized us into his Son, Jesus Christ. Okay. And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to even be with her. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hands, and he fled, and he got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand, and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household, and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house." So she lied through her teeth. She was angry and hated Joseph because he refused to submit to her and to sin with her. And so this is the way she takes revenge. She lies and claims that it was his idea and that he was trying to rape her, basically. Yes.
Joseph had told the husband that she's persisting to lie with him and telling him to divorce her because she's doing this?
Why would her husband believe her instead of Joseph? You'll see what happens next. See? Okay. All right. So she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. Remember, she had his garment. She told him the same story that she told the others, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came into me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me
and he fled out of the house. And as soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. Because Potiphar saw the garment there as proof, and he trusted his wife. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. All right, so for being righteous, Joseph was cast into prison. Another important lesson for us to remember. The fact that God is with us does not mean that we will not suffer. We will suffer in this world. And often we will suffer specifically because we did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just like Joseph did. He was a righteous man and he did what was right, and for doing that, he was being punished.
Like with John.
Yeah, like with John. Like with all the martyrs, for example, who were killed because of because they refused to abandon Christ and to forsake faith in him. All right, so Joseph's now in prison. But even when that happens, we should never take our suffering as proof that God is no longer with us. What does it say next? But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, Joseph was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him, and whatever Joseph did, the Lord made it succeed. So it's kind of like a repeat. Joseph has a new master now, the prison keeper, and the prison keeper found out the same thing that Potiphar found out, that he could trust Joseph, and if he put things into Joseph's charge and command, everything worked out better. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. We're not told what it was, or if it was two separate offenses, or if both of them were together in it. But they displeased Pharaoh in some way, so he threw him in prison. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them in the custody in the prison of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. And they continued for some time in custody. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison. Each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers, who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" And they said to him, "We've had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." Well, in Pharaoh's court, Pharaoh would have had his own wise men and magicians and dream interpreters, right? And we find out later that he does. Well, the officers of Pharaoh would have had access to those men. And now here they're in prison, and they're given a troubling dream. It's not just one of those silly dreams that we have, but they could tell that this was different, that this particular dream had a meaning, but they didn't know what. And so the ancient peoples pretty much universally recognized their dreams as manifestations and portents of reality. And they weren't wrong in that. God absolutely did give dreams in this way, and still does. And so you see the supernatural view that was natural to the ancient peoples that we've lost today. So, Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." And so, God can interpret the dreams, because after all, God's the one who sent them. And God will do it through means. And so, God gave Joseph the wisdom to interpret dreams. And so, even though
the interpretation is going to come through Joseph, Joseph credits it to God because it is God who truly interprets. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes, and Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. And I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Then Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office. And you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, so to get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews. And here I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit." And so Joseph was put there through no fault of his own, and God was with him. But that does not mean that there was anything wrong with trying to get out of a bad situation. And so Joseph is not in rebellion for saying, "Help me. I'm being falsely accused and imprisoned. Talk to Pharaoh on my behalf so that he can release me from the prison." We see something somewhat similar where Paul talks about slaves, and he says, if you are able to be freed, then absolutely be freed. So there was no sin for a slave at that time to want to be freed. He says, but if you're not able, then be content with the position that you have and serve faithfully in it. And so Joseph, even though he's there in prison, you'd expect him to be angry, because any of us would be if we were in his same position. We did what was right, and now we're being punished for doing what was right. Some people even get angry at God for that, right? And yeah, Joseph was not angry with God, and he still served the Lord faithfully, and yet he still sought to be released. Okay. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said, all right, that worked out good for him. He said to Joseph, I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants, and he restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but he forgot him. In other words, it so often happens. We cry out for help when we are in trouble, and then as soon as the trouble passes, we quickly forget our deliverance and act as if everything is just normal, and even forget to be thankful for what we have. After 2 whole years, 2 years later, so after 2 years after the cupbearer was now back in Pharaoh's household, after 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And behold, there came out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows came, ugly and thin, up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke. And he fell asleep, and he dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind.
and the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So, you can see the parallels between the two dreams quite obviously, which probably helped tell Pharaoh that this was not an ordinary dream, right? And so he's troubled now. And he sent for all the magicians of Egypt and all of its wise men. Like I said, Pharaoh had his dream interpreters. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. All right. The wise men and interpreters in Pharaoh's court, for whatever reason, didn't attempt to interpret the dream, even though they could have made something up. And I'm sure we don't know exactly how this went with them, but you know how it can go. People can give vague answers so that you can, when things happen later, you can apply what they say to real world events. I think the problem here is that these two dreams were so specific and the same elements were repeated in them that they couldn't fake it. But here, instead of getting vague answers, Joseph's answers to the baker and the cupbearer were right, straightforward, and exactly what he said happened 3 days later. And so that's impressive, right?
Another interesting point is it says, the cupbearer says a young Hebrew, so I wonder at this point how old Joseph was.
Well, he's still young by general standards. Remember, this is probably only a few years. So he's 2 years in prison. We don't know how long he was in Potiphar's house, probably a year or two at most. And so it's only a few years have passed since he was sold into slavery, and he was one of the youngest of the brothers. Not old enough to be out there on his own, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so don't know exactly the age, maybe 15, 16 perhaps. We're not sure. Okay. Or 17 by this time, it's hard to say. A young Hebrew was, okay, so. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph. And they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself, because when you're in prison, you don't have access to a razor or anything else. When he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is none who can interpret it. I have heard it said that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And so Pharaoh, making the obvious connection, thinking, oh, this man has great wisdom. Joseph responds. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, in my dream, I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I had never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, because they were still just as ugly as at the beginning. And then I awoke. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good. 7 ears, withered, thin and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the good ears. And I told this to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all of the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow. For it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. So it's not the kind of a dream that would be like a warning, like if you don't do this, something bad is going to happen to you. No, it was God simply revealing what was coming, and then there was no way to avoid it.
Let's see, then there was a way to avoid it.
No. The fact that there would be years of plenty followed by years of famine, that fact could not be changed. You could prepare, but the actual event itself would absolutely happen, is the point. That's what he means by it's fixed. So nothing Pharaoh did, nothing Joseph did, or anyone did would change that fact. That these 7 years of plenty were going to be followed by one of the most severe famines they'd ever heard of. Yeah. Okay. So, now that you have that information, though, you have an opportunity. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and to take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. You think of normally a king gets a tenth, or you think of a tenth of whatever everybody has, normally is given. Well, you got a terrible famine coming, and you got these years of plenty, you better take a lot more. And so, 1/5. That's a lot. 20% of everything that anybody produced was to be taken. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. The food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. What's the normal temptation when you have massive crops like this? Well, food is money, right? Egypt was a mercantile society in the sense that they exported their products throughout the known world, sold them. So if they had massive crops, it meant gold, right? So the temptation is, I've got plenty. I'll just sell it, and I'm going to fill my treasury with gold. Except, had they done that, then the years of famine came, and Pharaoh and Egypt would cease to be a nation. They would just starve to death. Okay.
So God sent Joseph to save the people of Egypt?
There were several things that God was doing here. You can see that he's setting up everything so that ultimately the 7 years of famine would drive Jacob and all of his sons to travel and settle in the land of Egypt. Because God ultimately would use this when he would overthrow the gods of Egypt with the 12 plagues and rescue his people Israel. And this became the chief event in the history of the nation, and became the type of things to come. With the waters of the Red Sea being a type of baptism, and so forth. Manna from heaven. When you think of all of the things that took place afterwards that became identifying features of the people of Israel, but how all of them, in every case, were foreshadowings of Christ. All of that is already in God's mind here as he's preparing the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this one, in whom is the Spirit of God?" Look at it from Pharaoh's perspective. His wisest men could not foresee the greatest disaster that Egypt had ever known coming. But this Hebrew man could. And Pharaoh recognized the truth of Joseph's interpretation. Can we find someone more wise than this? All of his wisest failed him. But here's this man. He has greater wisdom than anybody else I know. So if there's a wise man that I need to put in charge of everything, well, I got the guy right here. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. The house of Pharaoh was over all the land. So when Pharaoh placed Joseph over his own house, he meant he was putting him in charge of all of Egypt. And so that's what he says here. Nobody will be greater than you except me, but only in regards to my throne. I'm still king, but you're the one who's going to be ruling everything. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. The signet, what was the signet ring used for? Do you remember? You've seen this in movies and whatnot.
For crowning the king.
No.
The signet ring was the signet of the house of the king, and it was used to stamp the
You
letters.
sign legal proclamations. So that you write out commands, you drip wax on it, you press the signet ring in it, and people would see that and say, that's Pharaoh's signet ring. I know this came from him because only his ring makes that signet. Right? By giving him the signet ring, he actually gave him the power to make laws in Egypt. He gave him his authority, in other words, when he did that. So he put the signet ring on Joseph's hand. He clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot, in other words, his second best chariot. And they called out before him, bow the knee. And thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphenath-Paneah, and gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. And so Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered. Okay, there's your answer. 30. I was way off. I forgot. So that means he was probably 24 or so when he was taken slave, something like that. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly. And he gathered all of the food of those 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and he put the food in the cities. He put it in every city, the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in abundance, in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. So we're not talking, we're not talking, double the crops or triple the crops, but just the fields produced so extraordinarily that they stopped counting. They stopped counting. Enough not only to carry Egypt all the way through, but enough, as we'll see, to sell to the nations around them who also were in the middle of the same famine. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. So Manasseh means making to forget, or something like that.
To forget.
And the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Making fruitful is Ephraim. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. There was famine in all lands, but in the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said to all of the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. What he says to you, do." So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. And of course, when you see these phrases, all the earth, and all these types of things,
But was it just in Egypt that it was fruitful?
yeah, well, it was, we don't know about where else it might have been fruitful. Egypt was always a very fruitful country because of the river Nile. It was unique in that way. But it was only in Egypt that seemed to have this great abundance for the 7 years. My point was saying all the earth means all the known earth, all the known world. It doesn't mean the entire globe. We see this phrase is often used in Scripture in a narrower sense.
If Pharaoh was only taking the fifth of the food, what was happening to the other four?
We don't know. Well, Joseph recommended a fifth, but when you see what's described after that, seems like they took a lot more than just a fifth. A lot more. So,